In this video, we will go over a very brief introduction to the dyslexic profile. What is developmental dyslexia? Dyslexia is defined as a persistent and unexpected difficulty in developing age and experience appropriate word reading skills. And we will see exactly what all this means later in the course. For now, all that we need to know is that this means difficulty learning to read. And in particular, it has to do with word decoding and not with comprehension. So in dyslexia, there is no primary comprehension deficit. If there is difficulty understanding text, it's because of the difficulty in reading the words. Dyslexia is highly heterogeneous, so children with reading difficulty of this sort differ widely in what they can do and how well they can do it. The common elements and defining elements of dyslexia is poor performance in reading and spelling tests. And it is very common to see poor performance in tasks that probe underlying precursor or closely related skills to reading and spelling. So what are the kinds of tests in which we see systematic differences between children with dyslexia and typically developing readers? Systematic differences means that there is a sizable and reliable average difference between groups of children with dyslexia and typically developing readers. It also means that individual children with dyslexia are likely to show poor performance on these kinds of tests. Note, I said likely, not certain. So first of all, we see systematic differences in phonological awareness, especially at the phonemic level. Differences in other metalinguistic tasks, such as morphological or stress awareness, are also commonly seen. We see differences in rapid naming very commonly, and in phonological working memory. Of course, we have poor performance of dyslexic children in reading accuracy, especially at early stages of learning to read, poor performance in reading fluency of all sorts of materials, real words, pseudo words, and continuous text, poor performance in orthographic choice and word recognition tests, as well as in spelling. Note that the first four of these are not reading tests, whereas the last four are directly reading and spelling tests. And these are the defining tests and the most important tests for deciding that someone has dyslexia. What are the kinds of tests that we do not see systematic differences between children with dyslexia and typically developing readers? Now, when we say there are no systematic differences, it doesn't mean that there aren't any differences ever. It could mean that the average difference between groups is zero or negligible, or it could mean that it is not zero, but it is so small that it is not of clinical significance, so that there may be a difference, but not an important weakness. The first and very important domain in which there is no systematic difference between children with dyslexia and typically developing readers is general cognitive ability. So intelligence tests have nothing to say about dyslexia. There are also no systematic differences in tests of language development, including grammar and speech. However, it should be noted that it is very often the case that very subtle language weaknesses are observed in children with dyslexia, which are of theoretical but usually not of clinical importance. It is also the case that difficulties with language tests are seen more frequently than chance in children with dyslexia. There are no systematic differences in tests of spoken language comprehension or basic reading comprehension. So children with dyslexia can generally understand simple text they read as long as they can make out most of the words in them. However, there are systematic differences in reading comprehension when children with dyslexia are tested not with simple tests based on single paragraphs and questions, but with more demanding, longer texts, combined text, and especially when reading comprehension is measured with time pressure. There are no systematic differences in simple short-term memory, so dyslexic children are not systematically impaired in repeating back simple sequences of digits or syllables, but there are consistent difficulties with more demanding working memory tasks, verbal working memory tasks. Let me show you as an example two different data sets comparing children with dyslexia to typically developing readers of the same age so that you have a sense of the kinds of things and the size of the differences that are commonly observed. So I chose these data sets because I have access to them, but they are not atypical in any way. The first one is from adolescents, and these are Greek children. And on the right side of each panel, there is the performance of children with dyslexia, rather of adolescents with dyslexia. And on the left side, there is the performance of the typically developing readers of the same age and grade. And these two groups are matched for nonverbal intelligence. So there is no difference in the test of nonverbal intelligence. There is no difference in reading comprehension at all, and there is no difference in digit span forward, which is just repeating a sequence of numbers. There are substantial differences in the demanding phonological awareness tests, so phoneme deletion and spoonerisms. There is substantial difference in RAN, rapid naming, and of course, there is difference in word reading and passage reading time. So of course, these are impaired in reading. And finally, there is difference in digit span backward, which is repeating a sequence of digits in the reverse order. So this is a bit like a working memory test where children have to both retain and process a sequence of informational units. Here is another data set that includes English children, with the white circles, and Greek children, the unfilled circles. And here there are actually three groups in each panel. The center group are the children with dyslexia. The left-hand side are children of the same age who are typically developing in reading. And on the right-hand side are younger children who are typically developing in reading and are selected so that their reading level matches the reading of the older children with dyslexia. And as you can see here, of course, the children with dyslexia differ from the children who are developing typically in reading fluency. Of course, they do not differ in IQ, but they do differ in phonological awareness tests. Here we have a spoonerism test, in spelling, word and pseudo word reading accuracy, and time, and other orthographic tests down here. And this doesn't really differ for the Greek and the English children. So the profile is pretty much the same because these tests were made to be matched as much as possible among the two languages. Two very important things to have in mind. First of all, groups aren't individuals. When we talk about the dyslexic profile, we're talking about average differences between groups. These are very robust and reliably reproduced in most, if not all, studies. However, this doesn't mean that every individual conforms to the group pattern. Indeed, every individual is different. And although the overall profile is very consistent, individual children with dyslexia may have their own areas of relative strength and relative weakness compared to other children with dyslexia. And they may be very impaired in one kind of task and less impaired in a different kind of task. The second thing is that differences aren't the same thing as impairment. So two groups can differ, but that doesn't mean that one group is impaired. Impaired requires an extent of difference that is in the clinical range, that is actually dysfunctional. And this is important to keep in mind as we evaluate subtle differences in language that are often seen with dyslexic children, which may be very important for theoretical reasons, even if they're small and not seen in every child, but that doesn't mean that children with dyslexia are language impaired. And there are also many other domains in which differences are seen that are not properly termed impairments. And you should be very careful with that. Many researchers aren't so careful. One final point I would like to make is the effects of the orthographic system. So there are some differences in how orthographic systems affect what dyslexia looks like and what the actual performance on tests is expected. One is the level of awareness that is critical for the writing system. So for an alphabetic writing system, phonemic awareness is typically very important. For a syllabic writing system, phonemic awareness is less important, and syllabic awareness is more important. For English, with its strange spelling system in which word beginnings and word endings have different consistency, there is also something called rhyme awareness in the literature. This has only been proven to be relevant in English and in Korean, which also makes sense given their writing system and doesn't apply to other European orthographies. So the levels of phonological awareness that are critical for learning to read in an orthographic system depend on some properties of the orthographic system. The rate at which things are learned and how they generalize also depends on the consistency of the system. So the rate at which word and pseudo-word reading efficiency is learned and the size of the mappings of different chunks differs depending on the consistency of the orthographic system. The relative difficulty of tasks can also differ among orthographic systems. In particular, it is commonly observed in every language that longer words are harder to read and that pseudo-words are harder to read than words. So these are the effects of length and lexicality. But the strength of these effects differs between orthographic systems, and the rate at which these effects develop or diminish with reading development also differs between orthographic systems. Reading accuracy is also another important difference. In an inconsistent orthography like English, reading accuracy is a very useful index of reading skill because children take a very long time to become accurate readers. In more consistent orthographic systems, reading accuracy is less useful because children typically are accurate readers even if they have difficulties by the end of second or at most third grade, after which they're best distinguished by tests of reading efficiency or fluency. However, in many English-speaking environments, the importance of fluency is not so highly recognized because they have so big problems with accuracy that need to be solved first. So you will see many references and studies that use reading accuracy as indices of reading skill, something that would not be appropriate at all in the Norwegian context, where tests of reading efficiency are most appropriate even for relatively beginning readers. The reason I'm telling you all this is to conclude that you should be very careful with literature that is based on English language data only, or with researchers who only take that into account. There are many good books about reading and reading development that don't seem to take into account that languages other than English exist, or that differences might exist between reading development and reading difficulties between English and other languages. You should be very careful with any readings that do not show awareness of the existence of other languages and of the effects of orthographic consistency on the dyslexic profile, and on the expected development in the performance of different kinds of tests more generally.